Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 103 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That is Gavin. Fia is on vacation this week. Gavin, do you have any predictions about this January? Because you have a history of those coming true.
I sure do, and I'm going to be safe and say no.
If you're not a very, very, very long time
Yes.
listener to the podcast, well, you'll have to go back and become a long time listener to the podcast.
It was
by
what,
the
like
way,
episode 4?
It was incredibly early.
I'll actually look
Absolutely
really quickly.
nuts. You go ahead and do that while I just go ahead and say
Yeah, bring us in.
A little behind the scenes here. Gavin and myself saw each other recently. Gavin held a reception on the East Coast for his wedding, which was a lot of fun. And I got to meet a few people, as well as the parents of a few people that actually listened to the podcast. And I've got to say that, number one, it was a shock to find out that people actually listen to the podcast. And number two, it was wonderful to meet all you. You were very nice. And thank you very much for all the kind words that you happened to share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and a little more behind the scenes sort of stuff. Both my mom and my wife Liz caught COVID at that reception.
At this point, I'm going to laugh about that a little bit because that's a little bit
right.
Funny,
we're both fine,
but
my parents are fine. Liz is fine.
Right.
I have been testing positive. It's weird. So my mom has had COVID. I think this is her second time, but my dad never caught it. Like, he tested and everything as you should, and wore a mask everywhere he went while my mom had it, but never tested positive. And so I'm actually taking a test tonight because I go back to work tomorrow. One of the nice things about, and Mike, I'm sure this counts for you too, one of the nice things about working at a school is that you get a whole bunch of time off around the holidays.
It's incredible, and there's some teachers that like are real defensive about this, and they're like, "Oh, I work so hard during the year, I deserve my time." Like, you can just say it's incredible,
right?
It's fantastic that you get this time off.
Yeah, totally. So, I have been off since I think the 14th of December, and then my first day back to work was yesterday. At the time you're listening to this. I'm definitely ready to go back, though. There's definitely such a thing as being having too much time on your hands. I've been playing lots of video games to the point where it's kind of making my eyes hurt. And also, just for the listeners, all the way back to episode 5 was the episode that was published on January 6th, 2021, the day of the Capitol insurrection. And I don't remember if it was that episode or I would assume that it was that episode because we recorded it, a bit in advance.
Right. I don't know exactly what the time frame was. I just remember that was still early on when I was still listening to the full episodes.
Right. Yeah.
Before they got published. It was at the very end of the episode.
Oh,
I had to record an update that I just kind of slapped right on the end for everybody. Which was, one of the funniest parts of the whole ordeal.
Yeah. God, 2 years later. Look at that.
Absolutely. So, as we are getting ready to get started here, Gavin, do you have some reminders for everybody?
I sure do. So do not forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on, and to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, as well as any other various social media platforms. I really should get Instagram. Liz keeps telling me that I need to learn how Instagram works, but
I think we need less social media. I think we should.
As a society, probably.
Well, I mean, that one's obvious, but just we should have to pick Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. We should have to spin a wheel once a month, and that's just the social media that we use for that month.
I feel like every marketing person is like, that's a good way to kill your brand. Anywho, make sure to rate us on all those things and follow us on social medias. That way you can give us feedback about how the show is going and how rambly our intros are this week. So even though I've tested negative for COVID, I definitely have a big old headache, mostly from being dehydrated and my eyes hurting from too much TV. Anywho, do all those things so you can let us know how we're doing on the show, as well as any future topics you'd like to hear on the podcast. if you'd like to be a guest on the show, we have some forms to fill out down below in the show notes. As for next episode, we're going to be talking about, for the first time in a very long time, a group of dinosaurs, the theropods, which are a very big, very diverse group of dinosaurs, probably the most recognizable group of dinosaurs to most regular people. So that's going to be next episode in 2 weeks. And before we move on to Today in History, I actually have a special announcement here that Mike doesn't even know about.
Oh, what the hell?
So, I actually, 2 days ago, the day this goes up, had a video up on a YouTube channel called the Paleocast Gaming Network. The Paleocast is a very long-running, really, really well-produced paleontology podcast that also you can find wherever pods are cast. And they have a gaming...
Wait. Why have I never heard that before? Wherever pods are... That's incredible.
You've never heard that before? Wow.
How is it that you... I've always heard wherever you can find your podcast, not wherever pods are cast. That was incredible.
Oh, why, thank you. But yeah, so Paleocast, really well-known, really big paleontology podcast, and they have a gaming YouTube channel where they talk about all the various, aspects of paleontology in video games. And so I, just this past Monday, had a video talking about the new Pokemon games that came out back in November. So if you want to see my wonderful face and hear me talk nerdy stuff about Pokemon for give or take 25 minutes, there'll be a link to that down in the show notes as well.
What was the name of this this YouTube channel?
Paleocast Gaming Network, but it is the British spelling of paleo, so it is Palaeo cast.
That still sounds like some of the most Gavin stuff I've ever heard.
Absolutely. And so the folks that run Paleocast are really great. They're affiliated with the Paleontological Association, which is one of the biggest, like societies, how, there's different, like the American Medical Association, things like that. But in the UK for paleontology, the Paleontological Association. So, really happy to be involved and be included. So if you've got some spare time and like Pokemon, or even just want to help support paleontological education, maybe check that out down below.
And definitely make sure that you check out that link that Gavin has posted down there. I was about to give a whole reminder to check the description, and then right as I was about to do that, you gave that reminder. So here we go. Yeah, I guess double reminder. Check the link below.
Absolutely. So what do you got for us for Today in History, Mike?
Pretty simple one today. So if you... the year 1970.
Okay.
What are we thinking about that is going on in the year 1970?
Vietnam.
So there's Vietnam. Good. Not related to Vietnam at all.
Okay.
But correct. Vietnam. What has ended? The year 1970 is like the end of something, actually.
The 60s.
So, correct. When you think of the 1960s, what is one of the most iconic symbols of the 1960s?
JFK.
No.
Space.
No.
Woodstock.
Closer.
Ooh. I got nothing then.
So you were closer with Woodstock because that is music related. On today's date, January 4th, 1970, the Beatles apparently had their last recording session
at
Abbey Road Studios.
Huh.
Apparently they were finishing George Harrison's tune, I, Me, Mine. I remember spending a lot of my time when I was younger just saying Beatles overrated, Beatles suck, Beatles this, that. And two things have gotten me to stop saying that. Number one, just like listening to the Beatles more and being like, actually, they're
pretty good.
Catchy. They're just sort of like some catchy, generally inoffensive rock songs and pop songs for a while. And then number two, even if you are like me, just like, the Beatles are no good, whatever. Like, your favorite band's favorite band is probably the Beatles. Like,
yeah,
like people that know music and like music, there is something in there for everybody. So, the Beatles are worth remembering whenever possible. And so, Yeah, today, in 1970 was the last time the Beatles were together working on a Beatles tune. Apparently, John Lennon was not there, but you know, he's John Lennon.
Right. Whatever that means. I don't know all that much about like Beatles lore.
Neither do I, and I'm debating on whether or not I like want to actually care
That's fair.
about
Yeah, that's
Beatles lore because,
honestly,
like,
as we're gonna learn today
yeah.
in this episode, don't meet your heroes, kids. Um,
Well, in that case, speaking of today's episode, Gavin, let's get right into it.
yes,
Something French today is what I'm looking at.
we sure are talking about lots of French stuff. So we're going to be talking about Georges Cuvier. And as we'll learn,
Cuvier.
I have no idea where the George comes from because that is nowhere in his birth name. And in the sources I looked at, I could not find why he started calling himself George.
Wait, that's
That's
all
true.
right.
Yeah. Again, I'm sure that there is an account of why somewhere. I could not find it. Anywho, Georges Cuvier. Some quick points about the man before we delve super deep into his life and times. He was born in 1769, nice, and died in 1832. So just that late 1700s, early 1800s time frame was his life. And historically, a lot of places around the world, a lot of kooky stuff happening, particularly in France. We'll talk about it.
Oh, not only will you talk about it, my sophomores theoretically should be able to tell you about it this year.
Absolutely.
None of them will remember, but like theoretically, they should
Have
be
them
able to
listen to
tell
this episode. So the important thing and why we're talking about Cuvier is because he is the father of the field of comparative anatomy, which is exactly what it sounds like. You look at the anatomy and all the organs, the way the different bones are shaped of one organism. For Cuvier, it happened to be vertebrate animals, so animals with backbones and other bones and things, and comparing it to another animal and seeing how they are the same, seeing how they are different. So while people had done that sort of thing before him, he was the one who really took it and made it like its own field of science. And because of that, because all we have of fossils is the bones and the hard part anatomy, he is basically the modern father of vertebrate paleontology as we understand it.
of vertebrate paleontology as we understand it.
Yeah.
Okay,
So basically,
that's a hell of a
Exactly.
title to drop on somebody.
exactly. Among other things, he was the founder of biostratigraphy. We'll talk a bit more about what that means, but basically looking at the fossils in the rocks to learn more about the rocks themselves and figure out what rocks in area A are the same as rocks over in area B based just on the fossils, which is really important in a lot of geology. He gave the name to lots of popular groups of extinct animals, including mastodons, being made famous currently by Elon Musk. I thought you'd laugh a little harder at that, Mike.
Massive. Oh, I didn't laugh because I didn't get it. I get it now, though. Well, see, here's the
Well, it's
problem.
not
Gavin,
funny
is
if
that
I have to
sometimes-
explain it.
Well, no, sometimes you're just a little bit too smart for me. And I had my like paleontology brain and whatever couple of brain cells that was. I was not thinking pop culture. And Gavin, well done.
Yeah, so mastodons are a group of elephant relatives that look very superficially similar to elephants, but are a little stouter. Their legs aren't quite as long, but their teeth are very, very different. And also, it is the name of a company trying to be a competitor to Twitter, even though it's not going to happen. Which is where the Elon Musk joke comes in. Anyway, so he was the first one to call them mastodons, even though that's not their scientific name anymore. That's just the popular name. He also named the genus Pterodactylus and made the word pterodactyl. That was this guy.
Mm-hmm.
As well as by far the most famous extinct ground sloth, Megatherium. And that becomes important later because sloths are real weird. He was the first person to... and again, with all of this first person stuff, most of it is like the first white European person. For context, some of it genuinely was like he was the first person to do this, but for a lot of the stuff, man, a little grain of salt. But he was the first person to recognize that Earth had once been dominated by reptiles not mammals like we have today. So while the word dinosaur would not be created until after he was dead, he was the first one to say, hey, there sure was a lot of big reptiles around a while ago and a lot less mammals in all these fossils. Maybe that means something. And through that, he was really the person that got the whole idea of extinction in the cultural consciousness as something that could even happen.
That still blows my mind that people didn't realize that, like, you could have zero of a species after previously having greater than zero.
Right. And we'll talk about
Like
that
that-
a bit, because his own views on this were a little interesting, because he was a very devout Lutheran throughout his life. So his own views on that were a little fuzzy, but he was the first one to really popularize the idea, not just in, the terms of science, but to the broader public as well.
Okay.
Although all of these cool sciencey things that he did, not all good things though. He was a horrible racist, even for the time.
Yeah. I mean, that is one of my favorite things to do when I have to look up people from, like, any time before, like, 1982, and just, like, go to the controversies section of their Wikipedia page and be like, yep, yes, they were.
Yeah. So Cuvier did lots of studies on the skulls of different groups of people, and basically concluded that black people had more in common with monkeys than they do with white people, which is obviously untrue.
This is some phrenology here we're talking about.
I've never heard that word before, but that sounds...
Really?
Yeah.
Phrenology is where, it's a discredited pseudoscience, but where, like, the bumps on people's heads and the shapes on people's heads were studied. And, based on where certain bumps were, you could predict certain, this or that characteristics of a person. It was taken seriously for quite a while.
I didn't see that word bounced around with Cuvier. I think it was mostly stuff just like skull size and different proportions of the skulls, not necessarily bumps and features. But so obviously he also must not have been that great of a comparative anatomist to look at two human skeletons and be like, this one clearly is more close to monkeys than it is to the white man. And then in particular, there's one case that we will talk about toward the end that I'm going to give a little bit of a trigger warning for when we talk about, because it's really rough to talk about, but still important, because like I said, this guy is generally really highly regarded in the field of paleontology. But as always, it's still really important to talk about these sorts of things, because even the important people in history are often not good people.
That's a good way to put it.
All right.
Or at least they're complicated.
Exactly. So let's rewind the clock. Georges Cuvier, or as he was born, Jean Léopold Nicolas Frédéric Cuvier. Again,
well done.
No, thank you. No Georges in there at all. Was born in August 1769 in the town of Montbéliard in what is now France, but at the time was part of the Holy Roman Empire. His dad was fairly wealthy. I saw several things describe him as part of the bourgeoisie. I think he was some high-ranked military person. And so his mom basically stayed at home and raised him. I believe he was an only child as well. So she had lots of time to tutor him. So by the time that he got to sort of the late 1700s equivalent of what we would call like a prep school, he was like well ahead of the curve around age 10.
Okay.
And around this time, he started spending some time with apparently another fairly wealthy relative who had the complete works of another very famous French scientist of this time, Georges Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon. More commonly, you'll just hear him Buffon, because he was, if Cuvier is sort of the father of comparative anatomy, Buffon is effectively the father of studying natural history as we understand it today. So studying your natural surroundings in the context of the past as well. So Buffon is also another big deal guy in just the world of paleontology and geology. So this relative had all of his books, all of his papers and things. And Cuvier would go visit this relative, and he would read these books back to back to back. And front to back multiple times. He was most interested in, it's mostly just referred to as Buffon's Natural History, just a large encyclopedia covering basically everything that was known about the natural world at the time, including physics, chemistry, biology, and even some like engineering. And between the ages of 10 and 12, Cuvier would read this encyclopedia front to back dozens of times.
Just for fun?
Just for fun. So
Nerd.
Kinda, yeah. So by one biographer who sort of wrote this big biography of him a year after he died, basically said by the time he was 12, he was, quote, as familiar with quadrupeds and birds as a first-rate naturalist. So any other nature enjoyer in the world at age 12, this kid was just as good as them.
How good was that for this being the 18th century? Like, how good were the best in the world?
I mean, still pretty good. This is when this was like maybe not peak, but by the time Cuvier actually started doing a lot of the actual publishing and his contributions to science, this was sort of peak global imperialism, where people were, European nations were bringing things back, and particularly France at the time was very wealthy. So the collections in the museum that he worked at, that we'll talk about in a bit, were extremely extensive. And so even though he didn't have access to them yet, he was still reading things about them. So more or less, if he went anywhere, with the exception of maybe Australia, because Australia wasn't all that recently colonized by this point, things from South America, things from a lot of Africa, a lot of Asia, would have been known to him pretty well.
We are still like 100 years before the Bone Wars, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Like I said, the word dinosaur would not even come around until like a decade or two after this guy died.
Gotcha.
So,
which is wild,
yeah,
but okay.
Right? So, as of 1785, he graduated from that prep school and attended the Caroline Academy in Stuttgart, Germany, even though he didn't speak German. Although apparently he was such a quick learner that in just 9 months at the end of the first school year, he won the whole school's prize for the German language.
Huh.
Yeah, so like brilliant, quick learner guy. Just a shame that he's a racist. After graduating from that academy, and that was essentially like the equivalent of like late high school. And like education stuff was not nearly as standardized across the world as it is today. But by this point, he was probably in his late teens, early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have a job lined up after he graduated, which is relatable. So he basically started off as a tutor.
I'm sorry. No.
Yeah, so he started off as a tutor to the son of some rich guy in Normandy, which is sort of the part of France that is right across from England. So yeah, he just tutored this rich guy's son, which also is a very common practice today. If you don't have a job lined up, is to be a tutor. And it was around this time that he started comparing the anatomy of living things, which he was still already quite familiar with, to things that were fossils, things found in the ground, which today sounds kind of obvious. You find a thing that we know was from an animal, you compare it to other animals to see what it was. But 200 plus years ago, that was not nearly as obvious to people. And so here's where his story kind of takes a weird turn, because by this point, he's mostly just like a smart guy from a decently wealthy family. Like I said, it's not like he had some job lined up after college, essentially. And so he just started working for this guy in, frankly, the middle of nowhere. Normandy, even still today, is not a highly populated area. So to keep learning new things while he was tutoring this kid, he would often attend local meetings about various subjects, mostly things like agriculture. At one of these meetings in a nearby town called Valmont, he recognized some of the lectures given by a guy named Henri Alexandre Tessier. And this guy was once a well-known physician and soil scientist in Paris, but in the late 1700s, that was not a good time to be a well-known wealthy person in Paris. So,
and Gavin, why is that?
the French Revolution and its associated terrors, as they're called. So this guy wisely packed up and fled out to the countryside and had assumed a fake identity.
Got the hell out of there.
Yeah, so he was still using this fake name, but Cuvier had read some of his papers under his real name, and by listening to the guy talk, just figured out that this was the same guy. And he went up and talked to him and addressed him by his true name, and the guy kind of freaked out because he'd been had.
Well, yeah.
And once Cuvier explained, "Hey, I don't want to revolution you, man," he wanted to learn from him. After that, they became buds, and Tessier introduced him to all his scientist buddies in Paris. And Tessier once wrote to one of his friends, quote, "I have just found a pearl in the dunghill of Normandy."
Wait. The what hill?
Dunghill.
When you say dung.
Poop. Referring to Cuvier as the pearl.
Poop. All right, keep going.
So, by this point, it had been quite a little while. He'd been there for a few years. So now it is 1795, which is after most of the French Revolution, but is still not a great time to be a rich person in Paris.
So just for some context, when I teach this to my 10th graders, we sort of go up to the Reign of Terror.
Right.
And then we don't really teach. We just there's other stuff that happens, but we don't. It's not important historically.
Right.
The Reign of Terror, I'm just looking it up now, was done in 1794. So there was still lots of other stuff happening. There was the White Terror. There's stuff that takes place, but the French Revolution, as most people know it, was done, by 1794.
Right. Yeah. So he arrives to Paris very shortly after the revolution happens, and he becomes the assistant to Jean-Claude Mertrude, the chair of animal anatomy at the Jardin des Plantes, or the Garden of Plants, which is the main botanical garden in France, and also is the headquarters for the National Museum of Natural History. And purely coincidentally, because it is, the premier place in France at the time for studying nature, this is also where that Buffon guy had been the head of while he was publishing that encyclopedia, but he had died about 7 years before Cuvier got there. So he was now walking in the literal footsteps of the guy who wrote that encyclopedia that he used to read front to back. And at this point, I went down a very deep rabbit hole about the museum and the revolution, because there's a very fascinating story, and the more I read, the cooler it got. A lot of stuff added to the museum at this time. So the garden itself had been like the medicinal garden to the king, originally. And then when the revolution happened, obviously that wasn't a thing anymore. So they turned it into a museum. And so the museum officially formed in 1793, so only a couple years before this. And pretty much everything added to the museum to start with was stuff that was taken from rich people who had been killed or thrown in jail. So all these rich people had all these things from around the world, including animals. So they had a big zoo at this place as well. So all the things in the museum from the late 1700s came from revolutionaries taking them from rich people and giving them to the museum for the public to enjoy.
I mean, that's like a nice kind of twist on history.
Yeah. Like I said, the more I read, the more interesting it got. So there potentially will be an episode about this museum in the future for sure.
Okay.
But again, all that had already happened by the time Cuvier got there. So Cuvier served as the director's assistant from 1795 until 1802, when that guy died. And then Cuvier took his place and renamed the office the Chair of Comparative Anatomy, which was, again, he was sort of the first guy to really popularize the idea of comparative anatomy. And this is one of the main ways that he did it.
Can you remind us one more time just what is comparative anatomy?
Yeah, so it is just comparing the anatomy of one species to another, or one group of animals to another. For example, a way to sort of explain, because we've talked about bats before. We had a whole episode about them. We haven't had an episode about birds in particular yet. But sort of comparing how their wings are shaped and what muscles they use to fly, that kind of thing is comparative anatomy.
Gotcha. Okay. Is that still like an accepted methodology today, or is that just sort of like the best that was available at the time?
No, absolutely. So I didn't take any classes that were like named comparative anatomy, although I know people who did. But I took probably 5 or 6 semesters of things that could be considered comparative anatomy throughout my college and grad school.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was, everything to a paleontologist, because you need to know what the anatomy is. And then you don't really know what the anatomy means until you start comparing it to other things.
Okay. So it's still a thing that's done today.
Yeah,
by serious people.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Okay.
So although Cuvier was that guy's assistant for 7 years, he didn't just get the position when that guy died because he was the assistant. He actually did a lot in those 7 years. So let's go over some of the things that he did. So he published 2 crazy important papers in 1796. So he'd only been there for like a year. And so the first one was called Notes on the Species of Elephant, Living and Fossil, where he compared the anatomy of the Indian elephant, African elephants, mammoths, and mastodons. And although at the time, mastodons didn't have a name yet because they were so new, so people just...
you mean like newly discovered, right?
Yes, yep. And so they were just referred to as the Ohio animal, because they were from Ohio. Sure. And so he was the first person to establish that the Indian elephant and the African elephant were different species. They had always been considered the same.
If I had to guess, so you said the African and the Indian elephant?
Yeah.
So my first guess was going to be that like very few people had seen both of them, but if African and India aren't that far away.
Right.
So I imagine that's actually not the case. To the untrained eye, do they look rather similar? Or would you be able to look at them and be like, something's different about these two?
Different enough. So, for example, the one you're picturing in your mind probably is an African elephant. The ones that have the bigger tusks, big flappy ears, those are African elephants. Indian elephants have much smaller ears, generally smaller tusks. And then their forehead also is much more sloped. Instead of like an African elephant, their forehead looks honestly kind of similar to a human forehead where it goes up and then curves back. Whereas an Indian elephant, their forehead kind of slopes back at an angle. As well as, some characteristics of things like their teeth. But if you don't compare them and you don't know what you're looking for, it's an elephant, And he was also the first one to very clearly establish that even though those two are different and neither of them are mammoths are another thing. So clearly he was like, where we find mammoth bones, there are not elephants. And if mammoths are their own thing and there are none around today, they must be extinct.
Yeah, that logic seems to follow.
Right. And then on top of that, he also established that the Ohio animal was even more different than the mammoths were to, living elephants. And then later on, in 1806, he would give them the name mastodon. He tried to give that as the genus name, although it was already taken. So that is why mastodons have the genus Mammut instead of mastodon.
Wait. Wait, wait. So the animal's mastodon
Yep.
have the genus. What was it called?
They have the genus Mammut.
Because another animal has the genus name mastodon.
That's correct.
So a mastodon's not a mastodon.
Nope, that is the common word for them, the common name.
Science. Going back to episode 1 here, science sucks sometimes.
Right. But the thing is, this guy was so popular and so many people read his work that because he called them mastodons, that is what they became. Even though that is
But not to
not an
science.
accurate name for them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Editing Gavin here real quick. Even though I just said that's correct to something else being named Mastodon, the genus before this, that was actually not quite correct. That's not why mastodons do not have the genus Mastodon. In fact, the reason is because some guy who didn't quite know what it was yet gave it a name, a scientific name, in 1799. So about 18 years before Cuvier tried to name it Mastodon, but because what turned out to be mastodons already had a name, that name that was named first gets sort of the precedent. So only partially correct when I said that's correct. That guy's name was Johann Friedrich Blumenbach from Germany, who was slightly before Cuvier's time, although he did die a little bit afterward. He was also an interesting figure in a lot of schools around sort of natural history at the time. He also did lots of racial studies, which we'll talk about with Cuvier in a little bit here. He came to very different conclusions than Cuvier, though, in that racism is bad, actually. Hot take for the late 1700s, I know. But yeah, cool guy. Maybe look him up after this episode. All right, back to the show. So again, that was just the first paper of 1796. His second one described a large skeleton from Paraguay, a smallish country in South America. And by comparing it to various living animals, he concluded that it was some form of giant sloth that lived on the ground instead of up in the trees. And he gave that the name Megatherium, and today it is one of the best studied and also the largest ground sloth that we know of today, being roughly Indian elephant size, which I didn't say this before, but Indian elephants are a bit smaller than African elephants as well. But so if this thing were alive today, it'd be a contender for the largest land animal. But nobody else had any idea what this thing was, because sloths in general, the ones we have around today, are extremely strange animals. They do everything real weird. Their teeth don't have enamel. Their vertebrae are very strange. They articulate to one another very weirdly. But because they were from a place where there was not a lot of science being done at the time in South America, and also a weird member of a weird group of animals, nobody else knew what this thing was. But because Cuvier was so familiar with groups of animals from all around the world, he was able to tell that this thing was a sloth.
Okay.
And he also concluded, the same way that he did with mammoths, he was like, this is very clearly extinct because it's a giant elephant-sized sloth. And if this was still around, we would notice it.
An elephant-sized sloth? I would imagine. At least I would think so.
Right. So, again, these two papers, published both in the same year, basically cemented in the scientific and public consciousness that extinction is a real thing that can happen. And he did that, like I said, in the span of a year.
Was there... I know you mentioned before about how when we say, like, the first to happen, we're usually talking about, like, white guys. But, like, were there people before this, and I don't just mean, like, a dude somewhere, but were there, like, prominent people saying this is a thing and they just weren't taken seriously? Or they couldn't prove it? Or was he really, like, the first, like, he just brought it into the public consciousness?
A bit of both. So he was the first one to actually be able to, like, show good evidence of it, as well as the first person to bring it into the public consciousness. And for example, lots of people, for example, like I know there's some like Native American cultures in like the Great Plains area where it's like a lot of the fossils around there are from giant reptiles. and they would recognize, hey, this thing sure doesn't look like anything around here. It's probably just gone now. And that's part of their culture. And so if he had asked some people, maybe he would have had gotten to a little quicker, or somebody else may have. But he was the first one to really convincingly show with, the data to sort of back it up.
Okay.
But he's not done. Still, while he's just the assistant, not even in charge of the office yet. So in 1799...
So this is all during the 7 years he was the assistant? We're not even at the fact he's in charge yet?
Nope.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
So once he was able to get to a place that gave him the ability to publish and have access to, specimens and fossils and things to have his hands on, then he was able to really start churning out work.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1799, he became a professor at the professor of natural history at the French National University, and then in 1802, he took over that job as the chair of comparative anatomy at the museum. And every 2 years, the museum would elect a new director of the whole museum. So not just, the chair of his department, a new director of the whole museum. That was this whole democracy kick that France was on at the time. And so they would do that every 2 years, and you couldn't serve 2 years in a row from what I could find. I didn't find anybody that was 2 terms in a row. So Cuvier was elected 4 times from 1808 and 1809, and then long gap in 1822 to 1823, 26 to 27, and then 30 to 31. So while he was there, he was a director for 8 years of the roughly 35 that he was there. And then he kept that chair position, the chair of comparative anatomy, that entire time up until he died in 1832. Among all the other things that he did during this time, he served as a personal counsel to Napoleon, who was doing Napoleon things around this time.
What year was this?
This was just over the span of the early 1800s.
Okay.
He was the president of the Council of Public Instruction, so like a public education organization, and many other important facing director type roles. And then, as I sort of alluded to earlier, throughout all of his life, he was a very devout Lutheran. He helped found the Parisian Biblical Society in 1818, and from 1822 until he died in 1832, he was the Grand Master of the Protestant faculties of theology at the French University. So this guy had a whole lot of hats. So that's his general life. Let's take a closer look at some of his contributions to science. And some of them we already elaborated on, so we won't walk through those too much. But the extinction thing, we talked about why that was super important. Although, as per usual with these old-timey scientists, even the ones that turned out to be right were only kind of right. So,
all right, fine.
Cuvier did not believe in evolution.
I mean, how are we post-Darwin at this point?
No. So Darwin published his book on the origin of species in 1859. So almost 30 years after he died.
I mean, okay,
which to be fair,
oversimplified to be
right.
Pre and post Darwin, but you could be forgiven for not being totally on board with evolution in the early 1800s.
But it's and it's often phrased with a lot of big name scientists that they were sort of the first person to ever do a thing, which is something I kind of tried to avoid a little bit in this episode. But so right. Darwin was not the first person to talk about evolution. He was the first one to put it in a way that made sense.
Right.
But there were other people talking about evolution just in ways that did not work as well as Darwin did, if that sort of makes sense. So, for example, what Cuvier personally believed to sort of reconcile his idea of extinction with his faith, because if evolution is not happening, how do you get new things when other things go extinct? was sort of the first question I had when I read that he didn't believe in evolution of any form. So he sort of thought that God would create animals, new animals, and then every few thousand years there'd be a large catastrophe and many things would go extinct to be replaced by new creations. Which we know is not how it works in the real world, but he also wasn't totally wrong about the catastrophes, because what he recognized as the catastrophes we later sort of identified as mass extinctions. So
what would the difference be between what he called the catastrophes and what we call a mass extinction? Is it a different name for the same thing, or have we discovered more about that since then?
Sort of just a different name for the same thing. He also, I don't know his exact thoughts on how old the Earth was. I actually don't really know many people's thoughts about like the general consensus on how old the Earth was at this point in time.
Okay.
So it's kind of tough to, because even back as recently as like the 60s, like 1960s, we didn't have great numbers for like exactly when things happened, which is often why you hear like when the dinosaurs went extinct at 65 million years ago, that was the number at one point in time. We now know it's 66. That's just a very small deviation, but back at this time, if you go outside and say you find the layer of ash from a giant volcanic eruption or something, and there's only like 2 feet of rock above it where you are, you could be forgiven for thinking, oh, this must not have happened all that long ago. And so a couple thousand years ago, God erupted this giant volcano and reset the world and put new animals on it. So not a totally unreasonable line of thinking for the general scientific thought at the time. So, among other things, Cuvier had because he had such a strong reputation for all of his various publishings and the offices that he held and things, his strong criticism of evolution and the ability for species to change is a decent part of what kept evolution from being more widely accepted until Darwin. That's sort of his short-term lasting impact. Like, well, if Cuvier didn't believe in it, then it can't be true.
Okay.
Moving away from evolution, he was one of the first biostratigraphers, which I mentioned earlier is sort of using fossils to say this layer of rock in this spot and this layer of rock in this other spot are the same layer of rock, even though they're not connected, but they are from the same time because they have the same fossils. That is biostratigraphy.
I feel like I did that in earth science in ninth grade.
Exactly.
Okay.
He also sort of established the idea of faunal succession, where the types of fossils you see will change as the ancient environment changed. So if sea levels rise, if you look at a set of rocks, it will look at it'll show a beach and then a, sort of shallow ocean, then a deeper ocean, then a deeper ocean as you sort of go up. So he was the first one to say, hey, the shape of these clams fit more for deeper oceans as you sort of go up the rock layers. He was the first one to sort of recognize that those two things are related. He also, like I said, studied lots of reptiles as well. He mostly did a lot of stuff with mammals, but his big thing with reptiles was he was the first person to describe a mosasaur, which are the giant marine lizards from the time of the dinosaurs, the one that eats the Indominus Rex at the end of Jurassic World, as well as a small flying reptile that that was found in Germany and brought to him. He suspected that these were from a time where reptiles were much bigger and more abundant than mammals, and he named the flying reptile Pterodactyly, which was then later given a proper Latin name, Pterodactylus antiquus, and now everyone just calls them pterodactyls, mostly because of him.
Wow.
And like I said, despite everything with the reptiles, he was best known for his work with mammals, that particularly mammals that were not all that well studied at the time because they weren't native to Europe. Things that were native to Europe, really well studied at the time. But things like elephants, manatees, rhinos, tapirs, seals, he was a big part in building any type of literature base about these groups of animals. So he would often publish an extremely detailed study going through all the anatomy of a modern group of animals, just so that he could later publish a detailed description of a fossil animal related to that group. So he would do double the work just so he would have something to compare his current work to.
And so is this like an early, literally nobody else can do this version of like peer reviewing?
Honestly, kind of, yeah. I don't know the process at the time for peer review, or if that was even a wide concept. I know that kind of started in England.
Right. But this is him checking his own work, essentially. And
this is him checking his own work beforehand, so that when people question his fossil papers, he could direct them back to his previous work on the living groups.
Right. Versus today, we would, in addition to checking your own work, we would, point you to all these other people that have, theoretically also done the same study and gotten a similar result.
Right.
He didn't really have that as an option. So he's just saying, hey, look at, look at this work that I've done, over and over again and gotten the same result.
Right.
Okay.
And as I mentioned, sort of most of mammalian paleontology is built on top of this foundation that he built in by this point, the early 1800s. And his main book that he published was called Le Règne Animal, or The Animal Kingdom. And if you remember, I don't remember what episode number it was, but we've mentioned before talking about taxonomy, which is sort of the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, the levels of giving things names. When Carolus Linnaeus first created it, phylum and family were not included originally when Linnaeus made his system. Cuvier was the one that added phylum. He was like, I need an extra layer here. I need some more ways to put things in boxes. And so the P in kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species came from Cuvier.
Mm-hmm.
And then people were just like, well, good enough for Cuvier. I guess it works. And these are just some of the highlights of his contributions to science. So this episode's going to run a little long, but we could go on and on, talk about all the things that he did. But now it's time for the racism stuff.
Yay.
So let's talk about the quote unquote scientific views on race at the time. Most scientists were also quite religious. Cuvier was not sort of an outlier in that. The more religious ones tended to think that there was a single origin of humans from Adam and Eve. The more racist ones thought that non-white people couldn't have come from Adam and Eve because God made Adam and Eve. So they must have been created some other way.
I got some bad news about Jesus of Nazareth, but okay.
Oh, right. Well, also, I think generally they considered like Middle Eastern, I guess Caucasian is the better term that they would have used than white. I believe Middle Eastern people are considered Caucasian by these people's standards.
Oh, I'd swear if we try and like bury down the logic of racist, we're going to get a long time and get nowhere.
Exactly. And so Cuvier was kind of both of these things. And I want to preface this by saying all of the following are his words, not mine. So he believed that Adam and Eve were Caucasian and that all humans did come from them, but that the, quote, Mongolian, or as he would also say, yellow, or and Ethiopian or black races were originated by survivors of some great catastrophe that happened around 5,000 years ago. So one of his catastrophes that he also hypothesized would have caused various things to go extinct. So it's also just a little confusing with his thoughts on evolution, because if he didn't think species could change, if he thought all people originally were white and then some became not white, little conflict there.
Mm-hmm.
As there often is in the logic of racists. And so another quote from him, quote, "The white race with oval face, straight hair and nose, to which the civilized people of Europe belong, and which appear to us the most beautiful of all, is also superior to others by its genius, courage, and activity." Not great. And then another quote.
I mean,
well, go ahead.
there's just nothing to say. It's just,
no, there's not.
Right. There's a small part of me that wants to try and give some credit to these people as products of their time or didn't know any better. And then there was people around at all of these times being like, no,
yes,
like
absolutely.
very loudly. We did a whole episode on one of these guys being like, no, you don't get to say product of their time. You don't get to say they didn't know any better, when like people did, and people were loudly saying as such.
Yeah.
And it's just so incredibly frustrating with people that, and again, this goes back to what we said at the beginning. Like, people are complicated. Like, you can both say that this dude was really important to science and, help progress the field forward, at an astonishing rate. And he was also a piece of crap racist.
Yeah. Yep.
Garden variety for the time, piece of crap racist. But
those are not well. We'll talk about whether he was garden variety or advanced racism.
Son of a! I want to swear. Can I swear? Can I do a swear?
Sure.
Son of a bitch! All right, here we go.
That may or may not be bleeped in post. We'll figure it out.
Well, hey, that's up to you.
Yeah. So one more quote. Quote: "The Negro race is marked by a black complexion, crisped or woolly hair, compressed cranium, and flat nose. The projection of the lower parts of the face and the thick lips evidently approximate it to the monkey tribe. The hordes of which it consists have always reminded in the most complete state of utter barbarism." That literally makes me just want to puke saying that. So he, like I mentioned earlier, made lots of measurements of the skull and other body parts to back all of his thoughts up, basically saying that other races were less intelligent and inferior to white people, and his work, and particularly these quote-unquote data points, have been used literally for hundreds of years by people who advocated for things like eugenics, white supremacy, people who use science to try to justify their racism. Gross. And so here is where I sort of transition to the advanced racism part, but we need a little story time first. So this is sort of where that slight trigger warning that I mentioned at the beginning kind of comes in. So the worst sort of case study about...
So content warning for what exactly? Just for so people have some context.
More or less human trafficking.
Awesome.
So this is the story of a woman named Sarah Bartman. So Sarah was born in South Africa from like a group of local indigenous people there. And she had a genetic condition that was not uncommon for women of, from this part of the world, that essentially causes excess tissue growth in the butt and hip area. Particularly much larger than European folks were used to seeing on a woman at the time. So at the age of 21, she was sent to London to be shown off in various, basically, freak shows. It said on her Wikipedia page, which we'll have linked in the show notes, that it is unknown whether she went willingly. And there actually, based on some other things that I read, there was some reason to believe that she may have gone willingly at first, based on accounts from like people who know who she seemed to be like actually close with, that like knew her before she left, that she did want to go, and even like made a deal like, I won't go unless this other guy comes with me, and then that guy went with her, and like someone she was friends with. So but there probably was some kind of coercion there, for sure.
It's probably,
to put it mildly. So,
yeah.
She was showed around mostly England and Ireland for a few years, and then even testified in a court that she wanted to be there. So England had just recently, in the early 1800s, outlawed the import and trade of slaves. And so some abolitionist groups basically sued the people that brought her to England. And she testified in court like, no, I want to be here. I'm getting paid for doing these shows. She's like, I'm making actually kind of decent money for a black person in England.
Right.
And so the judge was like, all right, I guess she wants to be here. And so by all accounts, she was doing decently well while she was in England and Ireland. In 1814, she was taken to France by some guy named Henry Taylor. Could not find anywhere who this guy is or what happened to the people that she like knew and came to England with. No idea what happened to them. But apparently this was under duress because that guy then sold her to a famous ballet director who continued to show her around France under much, much worse conditions than she had in England. By the time she got to Paris, she was in really, really bad shape. And instead of helping her, the various scientific minds around Paris, including Cuvier, decided to study her and would draw pictures of her nearly nude. And in 1815, so a year or so after she got to France, she died of either smallpox, pneumonia, or syphilis, potentially a combination of the three, at the age of 26. After her death, that ballet guy then sold her remains to the Natural History Museum that Cuvier worked at, where Cuvier dissected her, not for an autopsy, like a medical thing to see how she died, but to study her. Particularly, particularly, like I said, skull measurements and things like that, but also he was quite detailed about things like her genitalia and those extra like tissue growths around the butt and thigh area. Yep. And so he did spend a decent amount of time, studying her before she died. So he wrote in it a whole report after he, mutilated her remains. And basically he included in the report that she was actually quite smart and was fluent in 2 languages and passable in a few others, was a talented musician. However, he also frequently compared her looks and actions to those of monkeys, which is obviously not cool. And then to top it all off, her skeleton and a sort of like wax dummy of her almost were put on display in the museum from 1816 until way more recently than you might think, 1937, when they were then moved to the French Museum of Man, where the remains stayed up until the mid-1970s, where the remains were then put in storage because people were like, hey, maybe you shouldn't be having this person that was trafficked into the country on display. Maybe that's not great. But instead of returning her to South Africa and her people, they just put her in storage. Until 1990.
What does storage mean? Like
museum collections. So basically a drawer somewhere.
What? This is going to sound a little odd. Like properly stored? Is that a thing in this particular context?
With regards to human remains, no.
Like it's not a thing?
I mean, it can be. I'm not an archaeologist or anthropologist. I know it is. There are certain things that you like legally have to do. And then there are things that are just like, you should do this because it was a person and not just a horse from a few million years ago. Right. So I'm not really qualified to speak on how to properly store a human body. But, so like I said, it wasn't until 1994 when the recently elected South African president Nelson Mandela formally requested her return to the president of France.
Wow.
The people in charge of the museum then began to consider returning her remains, and there were debates even in things like the French Parliament as to whether she should be returned or not. But after lots of legal stuff, in May of 2002, she was returned to South Africa and buried properly. Her name is now on lots of things in South Africa, including a center for women and children, a survivors home for like domestic violence survivors, as well as South Africa's first offshore environmental protection vessel, and the main hall of the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And so there will be lots of links in the show notes for you to learn more about her. Lots of details of her life are actually known, which I think is really interesting for it being 200 years ago, and it for being, a case where you just wouldn't expect people to have taken down much about her before, like outside of the gross, weird science stuff. And so, all that said and done, this is an excellent example of why history needs context. All history needs context.
Yeah, that is a boring way to put it, but it's true.
Well, thanks, Mike. You're the history guy here.
No, but like it's something that I try to impart on like my students though. It's just like it's hard to be like guys or like people are all good or all bad or like stuff is easy. Like so yeah, like the boring work is learning all the context surrounding everything.
Yeah.
And it's like, but that is the work.
Exactly. And so Cuvier is without a doubt one of the best scientists who ever lived. Like, I don't think anybody who like knows what he has contributed to science would dispute that. But he's always going to have that asterisk next to his name for obviously, the individual case that we just talked about, but also just for fueling scientific racism for the last 200 years as well.
Mm-hmm. Does his name still... I mean, I guess I don't know how often you hang around in scientific racist circles now. Like, does his name still get cited and brought up now amongst these morons? Or is that part sort of faded into history and been picked up by other people?
I would be shocked if it didn't.
Okay.
I would be surprised. Mostly because of how meticulous he was with his record keeping. And like any reasonable person who today knows comparative anatomy would come to the same conclusions. If you already have the conclusion in your mind that black people and white people and people of different races are different, then his conclusions really back you up. If you already have that preconceived notion. But anybody who comes at it, obviously, without being a racist, does not find that.
Yeah. Unless they listen to this podcast.
Well, no, this podcast is not racist.
No, I'm not. That's not what I.
I know, buddy. I know.
You're the racist. You're the one that said all those things.
I know. It literally made me feel so bad.
I mean, yeah.
But that's also, part of teaching history is, granted you teach high schoolers, so some of the things that I'm sure were said by who there was somebody where we had an episode early where it was like, yeah, they were against slavery, but they still hated black people.
Oh, that was probably our episode on Governor Morris.
But
was it one of my episodes or was it one of yours?
I don't know. It might not even have been a whole episode. It might have just been like a conversation in passing during an episode or something.
I mean, that may well be like Abraham Lincoln, but
right. I think that's sort of the first
people
one that
aren't
came
ready
to
for
my
that
mind.
Conversation. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Abraham Lincoln did not like slavery, but also did not like black people.
Also, didn't hate slavery compared to some other people at the time.
Yeah, that's fair.
Get ready for my conversation on why I don't like Lincoln later on.
I mean, you do have an episode coming up in a couple weeks, so
I do. I got a couple weeks to get ready for that.
Anyway, thank you all for listening, and yeah, I don't even know where to go after talking about all that racism stuff. Go learn about Sarah Bartman. You will be sad, but it ends happily, as it should, with her remains being returned to her people.
Hopefully that ends well, unlike this episode, which is going to end right now. Thank you for listening to episode 103 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That is Gavin. We hope to see you guys back here in another 2 weeks. Until then, take care, everybody.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.